Hello everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Stupid for the 9th of October 2016. Wait, I'm channeling Sargon of Akkad, that's how he starts his videos. So, I've been doing a series. I started off with fat shaming and got into the whole LGBT community, so I was going to continue that series until I came across this video from Sargon of Akkad. It's called Answers for Libertarians, and basically there was a series of questions by a bunch of semi-famous and famous libertarian YouTubers, or just libertarians in general, and they had a bunch of questions, and Sargon went through and answered them, and he answered most of them in a completely idiotic way, and so I had to, I felt compelled to respond to his rebuttal, and just point out some of the inaccuracies, the inconsistencies, and just the overall thoughtlessness put into his answers. I started to make this video last weekend, but then my camera broke, and so I had to get a new one. So Sargon says that no one identifies as a statist, and the first question starts off, "Hey, statist!" So the definition of statist from the Wikipedia article on it. Okay, so this is for statism. In political science, statism is the belief that the state should control either economic or social policy, or both to some degree. So this means anyone who thinks that government can solve any issue, no matter how small. This means you think the government should only be in charge of the price of bubblegum or whatever. Even if it's something small like that, that would make you a statist. Now, the degree to which you support the government in its ability to solve issues can determine whether you are a minarchist or a totalitarian. So totalitarian is you think the government should be pretty much in control of everything and in control of everyone's lives. This is akin to a dictatorship. A dictatorship is a totalitarian government run by one person, where that one person says, you can do this, you can't do that. Totalitarian can be any form of government as long as the government is in charge of people's everyday lives. And all decisions must have the approval of the government that is there. So, minarchist means you believe in the smallest amount of government necessary to keep society together. And I think Sargon kind of falls into this category. At least from his responses in previous videos. I've been following his YouTube for almost a year now. And this is the impression that I get, is that he's very minarchist in about 80% of his beliefs. And it's those 20% where he doesn't go to the middle range. He goes completely to the authoritarian, totalitarian, government should be controlling this aspect of it. So now that we've established what statism is, and you can extrapolate what a statist is based on that, is anyone who supports that notion, the term "hey, statist" actually has meaning and function now, because it's referring to anyone who has that sort of belief. And it's necessary because libertarians are pointing out that they don't think the government should be solving all of those problems. And if you're an anarcho-capitalist like I am, you don't think government should be solving any problems. And you think that society can function without government. Now, most libertarians, the majority of libertarians don't quite hold that viewpoint. They just think that the minimum amount of government, so they all follow, or they gear towards the minarchist for the most part. And so Sargon says that nobody identifies themselves as a statist. So I came up with this list that people could be, but wouldn't want to self-identify as. A moron, a rapist, a murderer, a closeted homosexual, a con artist, a bigot, or a 30-year-old virgin, a degenerate, the product of incest, a bastard, a dictator, a mime, or a straight male Taylor Swift fan over the age of 14. I'm sure all of these things exist, and I know most of them do. Some of them are just thrown in there for, hopefully, humorous effect. It's not something that you greet people and say, "Hey everybody, I'm a bigot." No, those are things that people tend to keep, sheltered or hidden about themselves if they actually know that they are those things. But generally, those terms are applied to other people based on their actions, what they're doing. And we're like, oh, that person is taking these actions, therefore that person is this thing. And I was trying to think of a positive one, but I kept coming up short. Maybe that's because I'm 5'4", so But then that got me thinking, tall. No one self-identifies as tall unless someone talks about their height specifically. I mean, Shaq is 7'1". He doesn't introduce himself saying, "Hey everybody, I'm Shaq and I'm tall." No, just people look at him and are like, "That dude's tall." Well, they point up to him or whatever and say, "That guy's tall." They say that about him. They identify that about him, comparing him to themselves. So that's when libertarians say, "Hey, status," that's what they're doing. They're saying, "You're different from me, and here's the distinction." So someone who's tall, you identify them as tall as compared to you. Hopefully that analogy makes sense. So, like I said, Sargon, I think, is pretty much in the minarchist, and that's why he says that he doesn't adhere to any ideology, but the one he would probably adhere to if he had to would be libertarianism. And that's why I think, because he's mostly minarchist. But then on a live stream, he said something to the extent that he thinks that CEO salaries should be capped. Which, yeah, that's why Computing Forever called him a Marxist. That's a very, very communistic and socialistic view or idea. Okay, and so what if this was up for a vote? Like, we were going to vote on capping CEO salaries. Well, I don't agree with that, but you do. And so one of us is going to leave that situation disappointed. Now, say if we flip it over and say that I was the one advocating a law, but instead of it being for the CEO's salary being capped, I was saying that YouTubers should have a salary cap. That they, since they don't produce a product, most of the stuff that they say is just rehashing of what other people have said. They may apply their own spin or anything like that, so it's not completely worthless. But, compared to like an iPhone or something like that, it doesn't have the same kind of value. So I think that they should be capped to minimum wage, which is, minimum wage is in the United States is $7.50, 40-hour weeks, and then times 52 weeks in a year, you're looking at an average salary of $15,600. Which is not a lot. That doesn't even cover my mortgage for my first house, or for my main house. I don't know how much you're making a professional YouTuber, but I'm pretty sure it's way more than that. Okay, so then Sargon goes on to say that he thinks government should exist, but he is not in favor of government. Which, to me, doesn't make any sense, because, I mean, let's take it and use it in another place. I think slavery should exist, but I'm not for slavery. I think abortion should be allowed. I'm just not for abortions. Huh? So yeah, it's the same statement applied to a different topic, and it doesn't hold water. It doesn't make sense. You can't be for something and not in favor of it. Now, the neutral position here would be the "I don't care if government exists or not, I'm fine either way," or the "I don't care if there are abortions or there aren't," or "I don't care if there's slavery or if there isn't slavery." That's the neutral position, and that's what he's trying to say, that he is a neutral position. But he's not. You have to, by definition, be in favor of something if you think it should be. Like, I'm in favor of the right to life, so that means I think people should live. It's to me, this doesn't make any sense why he would make this statement, which is, to me, it's very contradictory. And he's generally an intelligent guy, but this statement, yeah, kind of makes me question all of the stuff that I've been listening to over the past year or so. To me, that's extreme cognitive dissonance. Most of the rest of his answer or his analysis of these questions, he talks about that a social contract is required. And I completely agree. A social contract is required. You think that the government is required to enforce that social contract. I think that we can get by without it. I think that we can do with the individuals enforcing that social contract on themselves and upon one another. So here's my example. When I was a kid, there was a field in our neighborhood, and almost every night after dinner, the local kids would get in that field and we'd play games like tag, Mother May I, red light, green light, Red Rover, things like that. There was no adult supervision. It wasn't like the oldest kid made the rules. It was kids got out there, were like, "Hey, what do you guys want to play?" They would name something, and then everybody would say, "Yeah, sure, that sounds great." And then they would start playing that game. And anybody else who came in after the fact, they'd be like, "Oh, what game are you guys playing?" "Okay, you guys are playing tag. All right, so I'll just join in." It was very ad hoc. So we would all play the games, everybody knew the rules to the game, and if there were any rules that we wanted to make, kind of home turf or customized, we would agree on those as a group. And there was always that one kid who wasn't really fast or was kind of slow in the head as well. And if you're playing a game like tag, there's a base, which is the side of the apartment or whatever next to the field, and you can't tag back someone. So there was always that one kid who knew the rules, but was tired of being so easy to catch. And when you tag him, you're like, he would make up some kind of excuse or, that doesn't count because of whatever reason. And then, well, when that sort of thing happens, all the kids would get back together and, they would have a discussion. I'm like, no, it isn't tagging you back because this person tagged me and I'm tagging you again. Now you got to go and tag somebody. Yeah. So that sort of thing. So there was that whole, when the group got back together, we could actually determine the chain of events through pure discussion. And if it got to the point where that kid just refused to obey the rules or refused to play by the rules that everyone else was playing with, you just stop playing with that kid. So you either say, hey, leave the field, and if they didn't, oh well, then you just stop. You just ignore them, basically. So they can run around all they want, but nobody's going to actively chase them because they know if they tag them, that person is just going to say, oh no, they're going to come up with some kind of excuse. So it just got to the point where, there was that kid who ran around and no one actively chased because he always had an excuse. I know that's anecdotal, but that happens all the time, and it's a phenomenon called spontaneous order. It's also viewed, it can be seen when you go to the beach and you set up your beach towel and all your cooler and all that sort of thing. People don't just walk by and take your stuff or move it, or it's not like a family comes along and is like, well, that spot's right there, even though there's other people's stuff there, that's where we want to set up our stuff, and they move it all out of the way and set up their stuff. That doesn't happen. No, they find an empty spot and they set up their stuff and everybody enjoys the ocean all at the same time. Same thing with like a restaurant or a theater where there are no assigned seats, and you just go and you find an empty spot, and it's called spontaneous order. It's the people aren't fighting each other over a seat. Now, spontaneous order does come to conflict when there are limited resources. And this goes into the tragedy of the commons and things like that, but that's where private property comes in. So if you combine private property plus the spontaneous order, you can have a structured society without an external authority figure to enforce those particular rules. And private property is an agreement it can be agreed upon by people within a society. And like I said, with the whole tag rules where where like you tagged me and I tagged her and she tagged him and he tagged her, same thing can be done with private property, and especially now since we are in the digital age where everything can be tracked online. It's what makes me really excited about Bitcoin and that technology, because that sort of thing can be applied to everything, because it's basically always how we've done property as far as like houses and buildings and land. Only generally with those sorts of things, the actual chain of events was stored at the bank or with City Hall or something like that. But there's no reason that sort of the registry of who owned what and the passing down or the transferring of that ownership couldn't be tracked in some other kind of system that doesn't require a government body in order to regulate and maintain. It would just be a company, and you're like, hey, I'll pay you however much just to maintain the storage or whatever, and every time it changes hands, you guys track that and store it on this database. Anarcho-capitalism as a societal system probably could have existed before today or before our modern times. It just wouldn't have been as effective or as stable. I think with a lot of our modern technology, we've got enough, because of our global communications, that we can now have that kind of society without all of the problems. I needed to go through all that to lay the foundation for the ideology that is anarcho-capitalism. Because, as you can see, Sargon tends to misconstrue that or take it to the extremes, or, I don't know what he's doing, but he's applying a lot of the same tactics that he accuses social justice warriors of applying when they're talking about feminism and fat shaming and and all these other things that that I've come to accept as complete and utter nonsense. So it seems like he's applying those same tactics in this area, and I think that's because this is his intellectual blind spot. And he's, again, with this later on in the questions, he kind of gets upset when people say that he doesn't understand economics, and he actually says that he has a very limited understanding of actual economics. And that's one thing that he gets criticized from libertarians. And that's what I don't understand, is why he thinks that is a condescending position, or that is something that people shouldn't, they shouldn't talk to him or talk down to him because he doesn't have a robust understanding of economics. And to me, that seems like a pretty stupid position, because economics is essential to everything we do. Because economics is the study of human interactions. That's why Mises labeled his book Human Action. And that is an economics textbook, or economics study, but it's an analysis that people respond to incentives. Okay, why is that guy walking instead of riding a bike? Or why is that guy riding a bike instead of driving a car? Why is that guy shopping, at this store instead of that store? Why do people buy an iPhone instead of a Droid? It's not always monetary, although monetary is the easiest way to describe economic understandings because it's quantifiable. It's very difficult to analyze quality because quality is kind of subjective, but numbers and hard facts, those are objective, and they're really easy to translate ideas using hard numbers. And that's why mostly economics deals with money. But really, money doesn't explain why someone would buy an expensive iPhone when they could buy a much cheaper Droid that has the exact same function. That's when we get into the things like name brand recognition, or software compatibility, or just personal preference. So those are all things that economics, helps us understand. And so if Sargon is saying that he doesn't have a very good economic understanding, then he should fix that. He should change his economic understanding so that way he knows more about it, so that way he can talk on this subject more. It seems like a no-brainer to me, but then again, I guess I'm weird like that. Let's get to the actual questions and the meat and potatoes. I hopefully will have time to cover all of them, although some of my answers and explanations go pretty in-depth, so I'm going to try to talk a little fast, but I'm going to try to cover everything. Okay, so Sargon dismisses the first question, and I think he dismisses it pretty improperly. He says that it is an inept metaphor because the government is not a bully, and they aren't simply taking their money for the fun of it so they can spend it as they want. Well, that's a completely, subjective view of what the government actually does. Because in many cases, and actually later on in this video, you actually kind of contradict those statements in through various questions that are asked in this video that you agree with, and also your own statements where it makes it seem like, oh yeah, the government can do what they want. And that's a little bit of a head scratcher as to why you would say that they aren't taking money and they don't just spend it as they want. So I'm not going to go too much into that because, again, that's answered throughout the video where you can see clear contradictions in his statements and his ideas. Okay, so the second question I thought was spot on, and that's the question I would hope to have asked if that guy T, the guy who actually put together this video, had asked me to participate. But I'm a nobody, so whatever. And Sargon answered it correctly by saying it was the tyranny of the majority. And then he follows up with a pretty epic fail immediately after, where he says, that's why we have rights to prevent the tyranny of majority. No, that's not where rights come from. And maybe you don't have the same understanding of rights as because you have the Magna Carta, and the Magna Carta was basically the England telling the king, you're going to behave in these certain ways, and you're only going to do these certain things, otherwise you're going to die. And so then the king was like, sure, I don't want to die, I'm going to sign my name, I agree to your terms. In the United States, it's a little different. Okay, so basically the Magna Carta was establishing that the people had the right, and the authority figure in the king could only do certain things. And anything that he did that would violate those rights was against the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta restricted his power over them, meaning that they have some kind of authority, they have some kind of rights that he can't dictate. In the United States, the Founding Fathers took that same kind of concept and they tweaked it slightly and kind of elaborated, I guess, more on it. In the Declaration of Independence, which the Declaration of Independence did not establish a government. It was actually the United States or the colonies that are in the that were in the Americas were separating from the crown. It was the abolition of their government. It was them fleeing a government, saying we don't have a government. And actually, they didn't have a government from the signing, officially have a government from the signing of the Declaration of Independence until the establishment of the Articles of Confederation, when the Articles of Confederation were again replaced by the U.S. Constitution. But the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers stated it like this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." So there they've established that rights don't come from the government. Rights come from a Creator. And you may know you're an atheist, so you don't believe in a Creator or a divinity. In this case, just say, instead of Creator, think nature. They are established by nature. They are a part of a human being that are intrinsic. If you're a fan of Aristotle, you should understand this kind of principle, that it is a part of being human is to have these rights: the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, among others, because there's other rights that people have, and those are just the three main basic. So I guess I gotta do a little bit of an explanation of rights. I don't want to go too in-depth with that. But a natural right is anything that you can do that does not prevent anyone else from doing that sort of thing, and it does not require any specific action from the other person, as in they don't have to change their behavior in order for you to achieve your right. Okay, this is why the right to life: I can live and you can live. Now, if I were to murder you or, attack you, that jeopardizes your right to life. But my right to life does not mean that you have to provide me with food, shelter, and clothing. I'm responsible for providing those things for myself. If you were responsible for providing those things for me, then it would be a positive right. Since it's a negative right, as in, I have the right to not be killed. So you can't kill anyone else. That is the right to life. Now, many people think that healthcare is a right. Well, the problem with that is, if healthcare is a right, that requires other people to provide that healthcare for me. And it requires me to provide that healthcare for someone else. That's not quite in the same... those are called positive rights. Now, natural rights are all negative rights. So anything that I can do and that you can do, and it doesn't require either of us to provide those things for each other. Those are what anarcho-capitalists hold as the only rights that people have. Okay, back to the tyranny of the majority. Now, democracy is the tyranny of the majority. We have our natural right, or we have our rights, which are there by nature, not by the government telling us that we have those rights in order to prevent the majority from encroaching on those. No, we have those rights naturally. That means, and they're unalienable, meaning nothing can override them. Nothing can supersede them. The government can't make some decree and take away my right to life. The government can't just make a law and take away my right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So that's what makes them unalienable. And yet the tyranny of the majority is exactly that. It's a breach of the unalienable part of those rights. It is a group of people getting together and voting on something and overriding those unalienable rights through law. And that is exactly what the Founding Fathers feared of a democracy, which is why they set the U.S. government up as a republic with democratically elected officials. Because in their minds, a true democracy was exactly that, the tyranny of the majority. So the third question involves the government spending tax dollars on subsidies and bailing out companies. And the question that guy T ends with is, shouldn't I be allowed to decide what risks I want to take with my money? And Sargon says once it's been taxed, it's no longer your money. It was your money before it was taxed. It was your money and you could decide what to do with it. And then the government said, no, it's no longer your money, it's our money, and we decide what we do with it. That is the complaint that we have with the government. And the other thing is the government can promise to bail out or subsidize some industry, and what they'll do is if they don't have enough money to cover it, they will either increase taxes. So it's like last year, 25% of my income went to the United States government. But they decided to increase their subsidies, in which case now, 33% of my income goes to the government, or whatever they decide to increase the taxes to. Then how can you say that it wasn't my money to begin with? Because under that kind of mentality, none of my money is actually mine. It all belongs to the government, and they just choose how much of it I get to keep as an allowance. See how that's very detrimental and extremely weird view of what taxes actually are. Taxes come from people who earned money, and the government says we get our cut of that money. You should be able to see how they're kind of a bully in that regard, but I guess for some reason you're kind of blind to that. Next question is from Julie Borowski. Oh yeah, nothing. And her question is about banning things that aren't actually harmful. And Sargon is in agreement with this. And yet, Sargon said that he would like to see some kind of cap on a CEO's salary. Yeah, that would be a ban on a CEO's earning potential. And I don't see that as a harmful thing, but you see that as a harmful thing. And that is the inherent problem that you're supposed to be thinking about for this question. That's what this question is supposed to get you to consider, is people think pot is bad for you. People think, all these drugs that are illegal are so terrible and horrible and no one should ever do them so much that they are banned. People also think that guns are harmful and they want to ban guns. People think all kinds of things. People think that you shouldn't be allowed to say what you want on YouTube. They want to censor your speech, and you're against that sort of ban. But they think that that type of thing is harmful. They call your words violence, and that's why they want to ban them. Because they think those things are harmful. That's the problem. Harmful is very subjective, and as long as it's up to a vote, we can think anything is harmful and make that particular activity or that substance or that, that item, whatever it is, that idea, we can make that something that is banned. Okay, so the next question is from Jeffrey Tucker, and Sargon doesn't actually address the question. Instead, he spends the entire time, critiquing the question and how it was asked, which, okay. So he doesn't consider the principle or the idea behind the question. He just, completely misjudges the question. First thing he talks about is conspiracy, and that governments aren't conspiring with one another to pick on the poor, like as if the U.S. government and China and Russia are working together to, to keep the poor and marginalized down. In which case, why would the U.S. need to conspire with Russia? Because the U.S. only has authority within the United States. So the question is actually asking, members within the U.S. government enact laws that are specifically designed to keep the poor where they are and to keep the marginalized where they are. We don't make the rules for Russia. We don't make the rules for China, so it makes no sense for the U.S. to conspire with these other countries. So obviously that's not the intent of this question. So he wasn't saying that governments conspire with each other to keep the poor all over the globe down. No, they say within themselves, where they do have authority, there are conspiracies to keep marginalized groups down. And this can be seen in the Jim Crow laws, in welfare laws, and the actual, if you read anything from Thomas Sowell, and how detrimental welfare laws, the minimum wage and things like that, and actually even affirmative action are to the black community. These policies, now they may say the reason behind them is to actually help these groups, but it's painfully obvious when you actually look at the statistics of what their actual outcome is. And if anybody actually, if anybody was seeing both, what they thought they were doing and what they were actually achieving, and they still continue to push those policies, well, then they're definitely doing it on purpose. In which case, most of the politicians, they know the facts, and they either refuse to accept them, or they continue to promote them because that's how they get votes. Rather than explain to people, hey, these policies actually hurt the black community, or these policies are actually no good, these policies have detrimental effects. No, instead they're like, oh, well, I get a vote out of that, and then I can use that to stuff my pockets and all that sort of thing. He said conspire, and obviously people think, oh, that means they're doing some kind of shady, underhanded deal. No, you can have a conspiracy that's out in the open, because the second definition of the word conspire is to act or work together towards the same result or goal. And as long as people are saying, hey, this is the thing that we need to do all together, and they do that, then it's a conspiracy. And I don't know how you can say that governments don't conspire, or that at least factions within a government don't conspire. And they do conspire to enact rules that help the rich and hurt the poor. And going by both that explanation and even your own explanation that the governments are run by mostly rich people, and the rich people are fighting against each other, and then the poor people are hurt as a, kind of like a collateral damage sort of thing, and the rich people don't even care about them. That would even further prove Jeffrey Tucker's point that government is not a good system in order to help the poor, if the poor are completely ignored, as you said. Now, if they're like my interpretation of his question, then it still doesn't make any sense for this system to actually help the poor when it has a history of consistently harming them. Okay, so he also mentioned zoning laws and business regulations. So he doesn't have to go back hundreds of years. He's saying throughout government's entire history, this has been consistently observable. You can go back 5 years, you can go back to yesterday and look at business regulations and zoning laws and see how those actually hurt minority communities. Those hurt the weak guys in favor of the strong guys. So, and as far as the government being the only way the poor can impose any kind of control over the rich, well, that just completely defeats the statement you just made about the rich not caring about the poor because they're inconsequential and they're just collateral damage, and they get exploited in the process of the government of rich people fighting against each other. Because if rich people are busy fighting against each other and then the poor can just exercise authority over them using government, well, then that's definitely something to be afraid of. If you're rich and you're trying to get richer and you're trying to exploit all these people, and these poor people keep using government in order to stop you, well, then you would be afraid of the government and of these poor people. I mean, because you don't want people to stop you from doing what you're doing. If the rich were using government and just fighting over power within the government, then they would fear the poor, because the poor use government to exercise control over them, according to your explanation. Because that would take away some of their power, and they're fighting for power. And the poor is coming along and taking away. You see how and to think that government is the only resource, or the only way that the poor can stand up to the rich, then you're ignoring the colonial Americas. Because that's exactly what happened. It was the poor and marginalized, religious refugees, political refugees, economic refugees that fled to America and started their own, and they loved the freedom of not being bound by rich and politics, and not being. A lot of people this is pretty obvious from the Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder's series of books, is people used to live out in the frontier and they didn't even bother interacting with other people, and yet, unless they wanted to, like going to a religious service or to some kind of a hoedown or some kind of party, or going to the general store. But for the most part, people were independent, and they loved that independence, and they valued that independence more than being under some control of a rich person telling them how to live their lives. So, while that's less likely to happen now because there's less land that is not, this is mine, and it's under control of this government or that government. But we can always make designated areas where government is limited, or where government has no authority whatsoever. So we get to the gun question. And Sargon gives a correct answer and a correct analysis here, where he says government is the monopoly of force. That saves me the hassle of trying to explain that to him. But for some reason, he thinks that this is a good thing. And monopoly is never a good thing, because it is an absolute. A monopoly is unquestioned or unchecked. That's what makes a monopoly detrimental, is there's nothing to counteract that. So a monopoly on, say, cars is a bad thing, because if you're the only source that people can go through to get their cars, they can change the prices to whatever they want, and you either have to deal with it or just go without a car. Now I'll get into monopolies in a different video. But for some reason, Sargon thinks that this monopoly on force is a good thing and is actually required. when most libertarians view this as that's a monopoly, and monopolies are bad. And monopolies are bad because there's nothing to stop a monopoly from doing what it wants. So if the government has a monopoly on force, there's nothing stopping it from increasing its power in other areas that we didn't give it access to enforce those rules. That's why you say the government should have the monopoly on force in order to enforce rules. Well, what's to stop the government from taking that monopoly on force and applying to other areas that are not specifically in those rules, to adding new rules? Nothing, because they have that monopoly on force. And that's entirely why the Founding Fathers of the United States put the Second Amendment in there. It's for a well-regulated militia. And don't get into the nonsense that a well-regulated militia is an actual, army with uniforms and all that sort of thing. No, a well-regulated militia, as it was discussed by the Founding Fathers, and you can read in the Federalist Papers and various things, a militia was every able-bodied male who could fire a weapon, and they were required to bring their own equipment should the need arise, like, say, exactly what the Minutemen did when they said we're tired of the British rule and we're gonna cast off their shackles that they place upon us. We're gonna leave their government. And what happened is all the people within the frontier, they grabbed all of their weapons that they had, they made a makeshift army and fought back against them. That's exactly the same mentality of behind the Second Amendment, is if there ever comes a situation where everybody should be fighting against a force, they're all required to have their own firearms and, to join the militia against this tyrannical force. That's exactly why we have the Second Amendment, because we don't want the government to have a monopoly on force. This is the check to that monopoly on force, is if everybody in the United States is armed, the government can't do anything that the people don't allow them to do. And if they ever overstep that, well, then the people of the United States are armed and they can go and fight that. Now, there's always the argument of, the U.S. government has tanks and bombs, and how effective has those been against Afghanistan? Huh? How effective have those been against ISIS? For all of the U.S. government's military might, they can't take on a bunch of shepherds and camel dealers and, pot growers or whatever, and opiate growers or whatever they do in Afghanistan. I don't know. Yeah, so there's only so much you can do, and it's much harder to attack than it is to defend. So if all the U.S. people of the United States were all standing up against their government, they would actually have a much better chance of actually winning, despite the U.S. government's aircraft and superior firearm power, because that's exactly what people in Afghanistan, while they have taken it to the extreme and come over here and bomb us, and there's all that. I don't want to get into the Islam in this video, but the fact that they're putting up a very sound resistance against these overwhelming military might and technological advancements kind of says that, yes, the Second Amendment, even if everybody just had a handgun or a rifle, we could still put up a really good fight against a government that wants to take away our rights. There's this thing that countries have, when they developed nuclear weapons, there's this thing that keeps countries from bombing each other to oblivion. It's called mutually assured destruction. And what it is there's a balance of power. And if one country launches a nuke, they know that all the other countries are going to launch retaliatory nukes against them. They're not going to leave the exchange for the better. It's the same kind of mentality behind arming all of the citizens. Is if a criminal or somebody wants to start an attack, wants to shoot somebody, well, then they have to fear that everyone else that is also armed is going to retaliate in like kind. So they have their one gun, or they have their several guns, or however many people, but they have to understand that if they do that sort of thing, there's an equal number or even a greater number that's going to shoot back at them. That's why we say that there should be the threat of force or actual force. Like, we would hope that everyone would consider their own safety and arm themselves and give themselves the equal firepower to those who would wish to do them harm. So also talking about the monopoly on force. If the government is using that monopoly on force to violate rights, what recourse do the people who have their rights violated, what recourse can they actually take? Like, just vote against it. Well, you've already decided that the government is taking away rights, so that means a vote is not going to help in that situation. Like, say, if they actually took away your right to vote, well, then, you just vote to stop it. And don't say that that's not a possibility, because I mean, this has happened throughout history. This is exactly how the Nazis got in charge. Hitler was democratically elected. The Nazi Party came in through popularity, and then they immediately got rid of all the rules that allowed people to change and to dictate what their government was able to do. And that's how they completely turned it into a dictatorship. So it's not completely unfeasible. And to state this another way, the Roman poet HUMANe, in his writings, he wrote, actually this is a translation of it, "Who will guard the guards themselves?" So in context, what that statement means is, how do you stop the corruption of the ones in charge of stopping the corruption, if they are corruptible themselves? And when you combine that with the quote from Lord Acton, where it says, "Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men." So if we can't make sure that the people in charge of stopping the corruption are incorruptible, and we know that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, then why would you put all of that power into one centralized body and put one person in charge of it, or put a group of people in charge of it? Because people aren't incorruptible. So they will take that power and they will use it to do bad things. Okay, and so Sargon in this question equates a society without a government to northern Mexico. In which case, hey, Sargon, northern Mexico had a government, and there was a civil war, and they disbanded that government, or they got rid of all the people who could actually, enact the government. It wasn't like they got rid of government and everybody just went to crazy anarchy and brutality. No, it was they went to the crazy brutality and drug dealers and Mexican cartels, and then they deposed the government. Same thing with Somalia. Somalia had a civil war, and yet for some reason Somalia is always like, oh, I guess, hey, you want no government, I guess you want to live in Somalia. That must be your ideal libertarian society. What? That makes zero sense, because it wasn't the removal of government that caused the chaos. It was the chaos that removed the government. So the next question was kind of along the same lines as the government monopoly on force, so I'm just going to skip that because it's already basically answered. This next question is exactly why I decided to make this rebuttal video. So Sargon complains about these libertarian questions being condescending. I already mentioned that. He says, oh, they're talking about all these economics. Well, the girl asking the question wasn't asking the question because she didn't know the answer. She asked the question to get you to consider. And actually, all of these questions are like that. They're not asking you because they don't know the answer, or they don't have an idea of what the answer is. They're asking these questions to get you to think, to get you to consider things from a different perspective. Because if you're never questioned on these things, you will just accept them at face value, and you'll never say, oh, I never thought about it that way. Maybe I haven't thought this through. That's the whole point of these questions, is to get you to think critically about these things. And if you keep falling back on I don't have much of an economic background, that is a terrible, poor excuse, and if that's the case, then you should get an economic background. Okay, the question was about the government always being broke, and Sargon's answer was, what good would it be if the government just piled up its citizens' money and didn't use it? Seriously, I gotta quote Undoomed here. Hey, moron! Fucking moron! Oh, sorry, I gotta keep this PG. Sorry, I'll edit that out. So I know Sargon's an intelligent person, but seriously, what good would it be for a government to take the people's money and then not spend it? Well, then they could just not take the people's money. Because if they take the people's money and they spend it on, something useless like an electric rake, well, then they've wasted the people's money. And if we didn't spend it, there would be no reason for us to take it. This goes back to that bully question, and how can you not see that this is very much an adequate metaphor? Because the government takes people's money and they spend it on stupid things, and then they continually ask for more money. This is the same thing as the bully taking your lunch money and going and spending it on whatever, and then he's like, oh, well, now the bully comes to a situation where he actually needs money for whatever, and then he comes and, beats you up for your money again. I don't understand the cognitive dissonance here. Because if the government actually spent its money wisely, then it could save its citizens money, and it would need to take less from them because it was actually spending it wisely and not just dumping it into these holes where it just goes away and doesn't do anything productive. And yet that's what a lot of these complaints about finances is all discussing, is the government spends money on subsidies, and we don't like that. So why do they keep doing that? And the government spends money here and there, and they always keep asking for more money. Why are they allowed to do that? The monopoly on force is the ability to collect those taxes. If they get to determine how much they spend, and they also get to determine how much they get to take from us. And if we disagree with that, well, then there's armed people behind that to make sure that we do pay our fair share. Fair share, yeah. I'm not going to get into the fair share thing, because that's ridiculous. And then I don't want this to be a 5-hour-long video. I'm trying to get it down to within less than an hour. So if the government always has an infinite supply of money because it can continually ask its people, or continually borrow, or continually print more money, then what incentive does it have to spend wisely? What incentive does it have? This is the same thing with the bully. If the bully can just go up and beat you up for your lunch money, it's not like the bully is going to invest that into a business or into their retirement account or into, helping a little old lady pay for her house. No, he's going to spend it on whatever because it's money. He doesn't care. It was easy come, easy go. That's exactly how we feel about the government. The government doesn't do anything but sign some piece of paper increasing that number by a certain percent. It's like, oh, it cost me votes. Oh, those poor votes. They don't care about that. As long as they get into the place of authority or, political power, if they lose a couple of votes increasing taxes by 1%, they don't care because that means more money for them to spend on whatever they want. And so you may not agree with the bully analogy, but a better analogy would be a mobster's racketeering. Because, hey, guess what? That is a business. And so that you don't have to worry about the parents not being in the situation. But that's a mobster coming to a business owner and saying, oh, it would be a real shame if somebody stopped your business or put you in jail. Or if something bad were to happen to your customers. And so then you pay the racketeer money in order for them to protect your shop. And actually, the mob protects a shop that pays them money. They will protect it from rival gangs. That is a more apt analogy or metaphor for the U.S. government. Because while they're providing a marginal service, in that they're protecting you from outside forces, there's also the threat of them beating up your shop and taking all your stuff as well if you refuse to pay them their cut. And they can always adjust how much they take from you. So the Sargon's next answer, this is the most ridiculous part of the video, and I think I may end it here, because this right here is enough to kind of put the nail in the coffin, at least for me. I'm on page 3. I've got 6 more pages of this, but I think I'm going to end it with this question. Sargon answered, keeping 100% of someone's income is not slavery. What? Are you kidding me? I don't understand this at all. From the Wikipedia entry on slavery, while a person is enslaved, the owner is entitled to the productivity of the slave's labor, without any remuneration. So maybe he doesn't understand income, or maybe he's got this weird idea of slavery as, some guy with a whip smacking a guy saying, "Get back to work, boy." So maybe he doesn't understand what income actually is. So income is the amount of money, or its equivalent, received during a period of time in exchange for labor or services for the sale of goods or property, or as profit from financial investments. If someone were to take 100% of another person's income, that's more than the actual slavery that the slaves in the United States experienced. Because the slaves in the United States, while they were beaten and poorly treated, they were provided with clothing, housing, and food. Now, under the scenario, 100% of their income is taken from them. That means they would have to go into debt for those sort of things, and no one would take that sort of debt because the person would never be able to pay them back, because they will earn $0 for the rest of their life. They will have zero amount of things to exchange for whatever the food, clothing, and shelter that are being provided for them. And he says, oh yeah, it would be hard to live like that. No, it would be impossible to live like that. Alright, so like I said, I wrote a bunch of pages in response to this video, but that right there, that's got to highlight that Sargon is an intelligent guy, and maybe it's the British accent, and maybe it just makes him sound more intelligent than he is. I mean, there's always that. British people sound more intelligent and more posh and proper than Americans. But in this video, every answer he gave just made me scratch my head and be like, what is wrong with you? Why didn't you think this through? I mean, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that maybe he was drunk or exhausted and tired. He said he wasn't at his usual place of where he lived, so the video quality was a little poorer than normal. So maybe I will chalk it up to that. It's like maybe there's something behind the scenes that made this a little poorer than his usual video. But I can't for the life of me understand why someone with a generally rational understanding and analysis of topics would put so little thought or so inconsistent a thought into his answers. Because like I said, and hopefully you saw the inconsistencies. I pointed them out. Hopefully I got through them all of them. I know I've got 6 more pages that I didn't end up going through, where he said one thing, and then later on in a different question, he agreed with what he was just disagreeing with, or he sometimes said it like back-to-back statements. It's bizarre to me. Because that's the kind of thing where if you were watching a social justice warrior, and this time I'm talking to Sargon directly, if you were watching a social justice warrior making similar arguments to support their points against your questions, you would laugh at them, and you would put a rebuttal video and just bury them. Now, I'm not gonna stop subscribing or anything like that, and I still watch your This Week in Stupid, and I mean, all of that stuff, but I think that this is an intellectual blind spot, and by pointing it out to you, hopefully, you will take that into consideration and take effort to fill in, so that way this is no longer a blind spot, to make up for this weakness where you're not seeing things clearly, or at least you're intentionally misinterpreting the questions as they're asked. Yeah, I didn't even get the Lawrence Southern's questions or a bunch of the other ones that were actually really good questions, and but I've been trying to make this video for 2 weeks now, and I just need to get it out. I just want to leave with this. I think maybe you've gone a little lax because you spend most of your time picking on social justice warriors who, you know, I'm surprised they can tie their own shoelaces, let alone try to formulate an argument. But when it comes to this area, you're dealing with a bunch of people who are intelligent, who value reason, logic, and definitions, and stick to those definitions, not just pointing you to a definition because, well, that's the official definition, and then we don't abide by that definition. No, libertarians are very staunch, at least the ones that I've met and the ones that I follow and listen to, they very much adhere to those logic, reasoning, and definitions. And so, I think in this area, Sargon, you're out of your element.